Hi, I'm Chris, and I'm back with another tutorial for Adventure Creator and Unity. This time we're going to be going over how to create puzzle logic as prefabs. And by that I mean making prefabs out of isolated puzzles or bits of gameplay that we want to be able to copy and paste as many times as we like in a scene all throughout our game, and have them all work independently without interfering with anything else. This is going to be an advanced tutorial, so I'm going to skip over the basic introductions of how to get started with Unity and Adventure Creator. If you are new to AC, then I recommend going through the tutorial videos, or at least one of them first. They're available at adventurecreator.org/tutorials, and here you'll get a selection of introductory tutorial videos that go over the main workflow. This is going to be done using Adventure Creator version 1.71.7 and Unity 2019.3. I've already gone ahead and imported AC and used the new game wizard to create a new set of managers. And all I've done, aside from the default settings, is set this to be a 3D game that uses direct movement, and I've assigned Tin Pot, the 3D demo game's player character, as the player prefab. I'm also going to be making use of the tutorial files package that's also available on the website at the downloads page. If I just scroll down and find the tutorial assets, and if I download and double click on that package, I'll get a box to import it. Actually, I'm not going to need all of these files, so actually I'll uncheck the Evil Layer and Wharf folders so that we're only importing the prefab logic folder. And if you look inside the prefab logic folder, you can see we've got two subfolders, and these represent the two examples that I'm going to be going through. We're going to start with a relatively simple example that still introduces the main principles, and then we'll go ahead and do something more complex with the door and lever folder. So for now, we're just going to be going with the proximity light folder, and if we double click on the proximity light scene, you'll see that we've got a sample scene that we can begin working with. So this first example is going to be all about making a light sensor, or a proximity light, that basically turns on and off based on whether or not the player is underneath it. In this sample scene, we've got this proximity light prefab, and all it is just a light, a spotlight hovering over the scene, and it's also got attached an animator that will play on and off animations based on the value of a isOn parameter bool. And these animations are very simple. They're literally just modifying the light's intensity number. But this workflow will actually be the same for any property that we can animate in a Unity animator controller. So before I do anything else, I'm just going to convert it into an Adventure Creator scene by going to the Scene Manager, and I'll organize it without folders. And then we've got this player start here. I'll just move it over to the left edge of the scene, turn it round so that the player is facing this way. And I've already got a main camera facing kind of over the whole view. And I'm going to cheat a little bit. I'm not actually going to create any cameras, any nav cams or anything like that. If we don't do any camera work at all, AC will just use the main camera. So if we now run the scene, the console will complain a little bit that we don't have a camera, but we are actually able to move around in direct control. You can also see that at runtime, the light has turned off. And that's because its default state is this proximity light off animation. Now, this being a proximity light, we want the light to turn on when the player is underneath it. And to detect that, we're going to make use of a trigger. So further down the Scene Manager, I'll find the Logic panel and create a new trigger. And let's just reposition this, stretch it out a little bit so that it covers a bigger area of the scene, and then we'll configure its action list. So in its trigger properties, I'm going to set it to run in background so that it doesn't interfere with our gameplay. It will only react during gameplay, that's fine, and this trigger type is set to onEnter. So the actions that we now define will only kick in when the player enters it. I actually prefer to work only in the ActionList editor. I think the inspectors can get a bit cluttered otherwise. So I'm going to go to the Actions Manager and just uncheck List Actions in Inspector. So going back to the inspector, I just get this big Edit Actions button, which brings up the ActionList editor, which I'll just dock over here. So this action list is just going to be very simple. It's just going to be an object animate action that we're going to use to animate the light. Now the light uses the animator system, so I'll set the animation engine to mechanim, and we're going to be changing the parameter value of isOn, which is a bool. So I'll set the animator to be proximity light. The parameter to effect is going to be isOn. Parameter type is a bool, and I'm going to set isValue as checked. And if we just quickly run this scene, as the player moves towards, the light then turns on. We then want to make it so that leaving this trigger does the opposite. It turns it off. So I'm going to add another trigger component, but I'm going to add it to the same trigger object. And that means it'll make use of the same box collider. So at the bottom of the inspector, I'll choose Add Component, Adventure Creator, Logic, and then Trigger. And we'll get another trigger component. Again, I'll set the when running to run in background, but this time I'm going to set the trigger type to onExit. I'll then edit the actions for this trigger and set again the first action to object animate, animating the mechanim engine. The animator will be proximity light and affecting the isOn bool and setting its value to false. So let's try that now. And you can see now if we enter, the light will turn on, and if we leave, it'll turn off. So it's pretty simple so far. But now let's work on making this whole thing a prefab so that we can drop as many of these light sensors down in our scene and just have them all work independently. I'll make the trigger a child object of the proximity light prefab and then apply changes back to the prefab. But the issue we have when creating prefabs with AC action lists is that actions from scene-based action lists cannot exist in prefabs. In fact, we can demonstrate by double-clicking on the proximity light prefab, going to the trigger object and editing those actions. You'll see that they can't actually be shown. They're not actually saved inside the prefab file itself. So what we're going to have to do is make use of ActionList assets instead. Now we've already made these trigger actions. They are very simple, but all the same, it's going to be easier just to convert these to ActionList assets. So I'm going to go to the Triggers Inspector and choose Convert to ActionList Asset. It'll then ask if we want the scene trigger to reference this asset. I'm going to choose Yes, and we've created a new trigger ActionList asset that if I double click, we've got this object animate action back. I'll rename it to Trigger On and place it in my proximity light folder. And if we go back to the scene trigger, you'll see that the actions source is now set to asset file, and it references this trigger on action list. We're going to do the same thing for this second trigger, but I'll just do it in a slightly different way to demonstrate how we can do that. What I'll do is I'll duplicate the trigger on action list, rename it to trigger off, and change the set as value box. And then going back to the trigger in the scene, I'll find the second trigger component, set its action source to asset file, and assign the trigger off asset file. So we can now go back to the root and apply those changes back to the prefab. But unfortunately, we're still not quite done. And the reason for that is that these assets make reference to this specific light object. And they do that using a constant ID number. If we double click on the asset file trigger on, you can see that the proximity light animator is referenced via this ID number, and that's unique to this instance of the prefab. And if we were to place down another instance of the prefab, that second one would get a different constant ID number, and so on. So right now, these action lists are only ever going to refer to this first one. So to get around that, we're going to make use of ActionList parameters, which are a way of changing action fields at runtime. So we're still editing the ActionList trigger on, and I'm going to click on the Properties box and check Use Parameters. I'm going to create a new parameter, and its type is going to be GameObject, and I'm going to set the label to light. We don't need default values because we're always going to be setting its value. And then you can see in this Object Animate action, we're able to override the animator field. And I'm going to override it with this light parameter. And that means that when this action list runs, it's going to update the animator of whatever game object is assigned to that parameter. We'll do the same thing to the trigger off action list. I'll enable properties, check use parameters. I'll set the label to light and the type to game object, and override the animator field to that parameter. If we now go back to the trigger that's part of the prefab, we want these action lists to update its own parameter field to the light parent that's on that prefab. And to do that, we're going to make use of the Set Trigger Parameters component. So I'll click on Add Component and just start typing in set, and then we've got this Set Trigger Parameters component. And you can see it's now giving us a space to set the value of the light game object parameter. And we've also got this box referring to the fact that we've got multiple trigger components detected. And so this is actually going to affect the parameters of both of these assets. And so I'll set the light parameter to proximity light. And then going back to the proximity light parent, I'll apply all changes back to the original prefab. And that now means that we're not depending on constant IDs, we're only working with parameter values. So I can drop in another instance of this prefab, and both of them will work independently. So I can walk over the first one and have that light turn on, and walk underneath the second one, and that one will turn on as well. Let's now take a look at the second of the two example scenes, door and lever. And in the door and lever test scene, we have an instance of this door prefab, as well as two of these levers beside it. And what we're going to do is make a very simple puzzle that involves the player having to move both of the levers into the down position before the door will open. And we're going to be moving all of these by using the object transform component. And to make use of that, we need to attach a movable component to any object that's going to move. So if I open up the lever-based prefab, I have this lever mesh, and this is what's going to be turning. So I'm going to attach to this the movable component. And I'll do the same thing for the door prefab. If I go into the door-based prefab, select the door, and I'll attach the movable component. And you can also see we have these marker objects inside the prefab as well. And these are going to mark where the door is going to be able to move between. So to both of these marker objects, I'm going to add the component marker, and that will mean we can use them again in the object transform action. I'll do the same thing to the lever-based prefab. You can see we have these two marker objects that have the two rotations that we want the lever base to be rotating between. So I'll select lever up marker and lever down marker, and attach again the marker component. So we're going to have the door react to the states of the levers. We're going to have the door check to see if either of these levers are up or down. And to keep track of the state of these levers, we're going to make use of variables, specifically component variables. If you go to the AC game editor and go to the variables manager, you'll see that we have both global and local variable types. Global variables are game-wide, and local variables are for the whole scene. But component variables allow us to associate a variable with a specific game object. So if I go into the lever-based prefab once again, with the root object selected, I'm going to go to Add Component, choose Adventure Creator, Logic, and then Variables. And then this allows me to define variables only on this object. I'll click Create New Component Variable. I'll leave its type as Boolean, and I'll set the label to lever is down. And I'll set its initial value to false. And we're going to want to store this value in save game files, so I'm going to add another component, Adventure Creator, Save System, and then Remember Variables. And that'll mean that this lever is down value is stored in save games. And you can see here in the prefab it has a constant ID number of 0. Well, that's fine because we're only going to be interested in the value in the scene. So if I select the lever base in the scene, we have two separate ID values for both of these instances. Now, just focusing again on these levers for the moment, we're going to break up the logic into two parts. We're going to have the logic that will come in the form of a hotspot that toggles this Boolean on and off, and then separately we're going to update the position of the lever itself based on that value. And the reason we're going to separate these is so that we can also set up the state of the lever when the scene begins. And this will be more clear as we go on, but let's just continue now by creating an ActionList asset. Create Adventure Creator ActionList, and as we found before, when we're creating prefabs we need to rely on ActionList assets because ActionLists cannot exist in prefab files. So I'm going to rename this ActionList as lever move. And this is going to be used to update the rotation of the lever based on its component variable value. So let's edit its actions. And what we're going to do is first of all read that component variable. So we'll create a variable check action. And I won't worry about parameters just for the moment. I'll set the source to component, and I'll just drag in one of these lever base instances. So it's reading lever is down, and we're checking is it equal to true. And whether it's true or not, we're going to be running the same kind of action. We're going to be running an object transform action. So I'll create a pair of those. We're going to be moving a movable object, and that is going to be the lever mesh. So I'll assign lever mesh into both of these. And we're going to be updating its position by copying either the lever up or down marker. So where we've got translate, I'm going to set it to copy marker. And then we just need to assign the correct marker. So if lever down is equal to true, then we're going to go to the lever down marker. And if it's false, then we're going to go to the lever up marker. I'll set a transition time of, say, 0.5 to each. And just to make things a little bit nicer, I'll set the movement method to smooth. I'll also make sure that the when running is set to run in background. And let's just test our progress so far. First of all, I need to make this an AC scene. So I'll go to the AC game editor, scene manager. I'll create the scene without folders, and I'll just move the player start out of the way. as before, I'm not going to be worrying about any cameras. I'm just going to use the main camera, which is already positioned to look at the whole thing. So if I now run the scene, view the inspector of lever move, and click on Run Now, you can see that that lever then moves up to the top, and that's because its lever is down is set to false. And we can actually just play around with this, set it to true instead, and test that out as well. That's all seems to be working now. I'll set it back to false. And now what we're going to do is we're going to make use of parameters for this action list so that we can have it run on both levers, or in fact any lever that we want in our scene. So we're going to want to make use of quite a few parameters because we're going to want to override the component variable that we're reading, the movable object that we're transforming, as well as the up and down markers that we're going to be moving the lever to. So in the inspector, I'll check Use Parameters, and I'm going to create 4 new parameters. The first is for the component variable we're going to read. So I'll set the type to component variable and set the label to lever variable. And you can see our variable check action has been updated with the ability to override the variable field. So I'll override that with lever variable. And you can see we've got our type is now a placeholder so that we can still run different actions even though we're not actually working with a specific variable at the moment. Next, let's create a parameter for the movable object. So I'll get the second parameter. I'll set its type to GameObject, and I'll set it to lever to move. And in these object transform actions, I'll set the movable object override to lever to move. Finally, we'll override these 2 marker fields. So these 2 are going to be set to GameObject, and I'll name one to up marker and the other one to down marker. And I'll override those up and down. So now let's use this asset to update both of these levers when the game begins. So it's going to update the rotations of these 2 levers based on their own component variable values. I'm going to go back into the prefab, and again on the root I'm going to attach a new component. I'm going to go to Adventure Creator, Logic, and then ActionList Starter. And this is a component that lets us run an action list when the scene begins, whether it's because we've loaded a game or we've entered the scene through natural gameplay. We want this to kick in for both of those cases, so I'm going to check Run on Scene Start and Run on Scene Load. The action list source is going to be asset file because we're going to be running this lever move. So I'll drop that into the asset to run. And we want to associate all of those parameter values with this prefab. So I'll check Set Parameters, and you can see this now lets us set all of the parameter values at the time that this action list starter component is run. So our lever variable component is going to be this same lever-based game object, and we're going to map it to the lever is down variable, which at the moment is the only one that's there. The lever to move is going to be lever mesh, and you can see now that we've assigned a game object, it asks us, do we want to reference the prefab or the scene instance? And I'm going to choose scene instance so that it never actually involves the prefab itself, only the copy of it that's in the scene. I'll do the same for the up and down markers. I'll assign those parameters and again have them reference the scene instance. If I then come out of prefab mode and run the scene, you'll see that these two levers are now pointing in the up direction. And to check that they're working independently, I'll select the first one over here and set the initial value of lever is down to true. And that now forces the first one, the one on the left, to be in the down position when the scene begins. Let's now do the same thing for the door here. So we'll create a new action list that moves the door based on the value of the two variables that we have on our levers. I'll go into the door and lever folder, right click, choose create, Adventure Creator Action List, and I'll call this new one door move. And I'll start creating the actions, only this time I'll create the parameters as we go along as well. So we're going to start by reading the values of our two component variables. So I'm going to create a pair of variable check actions. They're both going to be checking component variables, and I'm going to create two parameters. One is called lever1, which will be a component variable, and I'll make another component variable parameter called lever2. So I'll set the first variable check action to reference the lever1 parameter, and I'll do the same for the second. The placeholder type we'll keep as Boolean, and we'll check that both of these are true, and if they are, then we're going to open the door. So we're going to perform an object transform action, and we're going to be moving the door as a parameter. So I'll create one more parameter named door. This will be a game object, and I'll assign this as the movable object. We're going to choose copy marker, and next we're going to create a parameter to act as the door's open position. So I'll create another parameter. In fact, I'll create two of them because we'll have two markers. Both of them will be game objects, and I'll name the first one open marker and the second one down marker. So if our two variables are both true, we're going to move to the open marker, and we'll move over, say, a period of, say, 1 second. And if one or both of these are false, then we're going to move it to the down marker. So I'll copy this, paste copied action. I'll set the marker as down marker. Actually, I'll just rename this to shut marker. And I'll have it so that if the first variable is false, it'll run this, and it'll also run if the second is false as well. We can now go back to the door base prefab and again add a Adventure Creator Logic ActionList starter component to the root. I'll check run on scene start and load, set the ActionList source to asset file, and I'll set the asset to run as door move. Again, we'll set check parameters, and we then are able to set all the parameter values for this prefab. So I'm now going to add the lever base prefab as a nested prefab. So I'll add two instances of lever base to this door base prefab, and I can now go back to the door base and assign these two as the two variable components. So if we now exit prefab mode, we've now got 4 levers, so I can actually delete these two on the side here, and I'll move these ones that are part of the prefab. So let's now test to see how these are working. Both of our levers have false set for their default values, so if we run the scene now, the door is going to be shut and both of the levers are going to be up. So let's just test things out by setting the initial value of both of our levers to true and run the scene again. And you'll see these are now set in the down position and the door moves up. But let's actually watch that again And if we pause the game right in the first couple of frames, you'll see that the door is actually moving during this initialization. And what would be better is if this is actually snapping to its correct position. And the way to do that is to go back to the ActionList starter component and just check Run Instantly in the inspector. And that's an equivalent of the ActionList asset being skipped. So if we now just rerun that, we'll see that the door move ActionList is being run instantly and the door is appearing in the up position straight away. So now that we've made the logic that processes the values of our lever variables, we just need to make the gameplay aspect, as in the hotspots that we can use to actually control the levers during gameplay. I'll first just go back to these two levers and I'll set their initial values for their component variables back to false. And now going into the lever base prefab, let's make these a hotspot. In the lever base prefab, I'm going to go to Add Component, Adventure Creator, Hotspots, and then Hotspot. And I'll also add a box collider, which will act as the bounding area that we have to click on. It's taking the shape of the base mesh where the levers sit in at the moment. So I'll just edit the collider and bring it out a little bit and check is trigger as well so that it doesn't interfere with any collision or anything. As with all the other action lists, we're going to have to rely on asset files. So my interaction source for the hotspot is going to be asset file. We'll have the player walk to a marker when he clicks on it, but if I were to create a walk to marker from here, it would actually spawn it in the scene itself because we're in prefab mode right now. So what I'll do is I'll just go to the prefab itself in Adventure Creator, Prefabs, Navigation, and then I'll drop marker as a child object of this prefab. I'll just bring it out so that it's facing a little ways out from the front of the lever, and then assign that in my hotspots walk to marker field. I'll create a new use interaction. It'll just have a regular use cursor icon. I'll set the player action to walk to marker, and I'll click to create a new interaction action list. This will be an asset file that I'll name lever use, and I'll place it along with the others. And this is going to be used to toggle the state of the component Boolean variable. So we're going to first check its value with a variable check action. The source is going to be component, and again we're going to need to make use of a parameter. So I'll create a new component variable parameter named lever variable. I'll use that to override this action's variable component. The placeholder type will be checking to see if it's a Boolean that's true, and if it is, we're going to set it to false. So I'll follow this up with a variable set action that will similarly be updating a component variable overridden by this parameter. The placeholder is set to bool, so we'll be setting it to false. I'll copy this and paste another one that runs if the variable is found to be false, and in that case we'll set it to true. We then need to have this variable parameter be set correctly when it's run, and for that we're going to make use of another component that can set parameter values when a hotspot is interacted with. If I go back to the lever base root, and I'll add another component, this time it'll be Adventure Creator, Hotspots, and then Set Interaction Parameters. And this allows us to set parameter values for any of this hotspot's interactions. And you can see it's already detected that we have a use interaction that has a component variable parameter, and we're going to set that to the root object which has the variables component on it. And we can see it's already mapped to the lever is down variable. So if we come out of edit mode now and run the scene, I'll select this lever that's on the left here, and just to test, I'll have a look at this component variable value while I click on it. And you can see clicking on it multiple times makes it toggle between true and false. Actually, I think I'll just go ahead and rename it in the hotspot component. I'll just set its label, if not name, to lever. But of course, updating the variable doesn't actually change the state of the lever as we see it. So what we need to do is also run the lever move action list after changing the state of the variable. So going back to lever use, I'll create a new action that's actually going to be run no matter what the variable was changed to. So I'll rewire both of these to run this new action. And this action is going to be a action list run action in which we run the asset file lever move. And that's going to run an instance of lever move that will be used to update the position of the same lever. But of course, lever move only references objects by parameters, so we're going to have to check the run mode to set parameters and run. And that allows us to set all of its parameter values at the time that it's run. So the lever variable is going to be the same lever variable that we already have defined in this asset. And we now need to reassign the other parameter values. So we're going to have to define those as part of this action list as well. So going back to the inspector of lever use, I'll create 3 more parameters. These are going to be all game objects. And I'll name these lever to move, up marker, and down marker. And I'll connect these all in the action list run action. We'll then have to go and update the set interaction parameters component. So if I open up the lever-based prefab and scroll to the bottom of its inspector, we have these new parameters as fields. So I'll set lever to move as the lever mesh, again referencing the scene instance, and doing the same for the up and down markers. Let's test our progress, and so we can now click on these levers to change the way that they're orientated in the game world. The last thing to do is obviously the big one, and that's just make it so that the door actually opens when both of these are moved down. And to do that, all we need to do is run the door move asset as well. So going back to lever use, we'll add another action list run. And that'll be running the asset door move. Again, we'll be setting the parameters and then running it, and we then need to assign all the parameters that go with it. And we start with 2 component variables for both of our levers, and we already have one of these defined, so I'll set this first lever 1 to lever variable, and I'll create another parameter, another component variable, and I'll name this other lever variable. I'll map that to the lever2 parameter, and we then need 3 game object parameters for the door and the open and shut markers. So I'll create 3 new parameters, make them game objects, and I'll name them door, door up marker, and door down marker. And I'll assign these in the action. So all we need to do to finish this is to set these parameter values at the time the hotspot is clicked on, and that means going back to the set interaction parameters component. But these values are all outside of the lever-based prefab, so we're going to have to do it as part of the door-based prefab, of which these two levers are nested. So if I open up the door-based prefab and find our first lever, I'll go down to its set interaction parameters component. I'll set the other lever variable to the other lever. I'll set the door and shut and open markers, having them all reference the scene instance. I'll do the same thing to the other lever. Assigning the other lever variable, as well as the doors, up and down markers. And that should now be it. If I run the scene, we can test this out. And I'll click on both of these levers in turn, move them into the down position, and the door then moves up. And just to test that this all works as a prefab, I'll drop in another instance of the door. If I just quickly move it over here and move its two levers, say on this side. I'm kind of running out of space here. So let's give this a go. It might not look quite right, but we'll get the idea. So I can move both of these levers and try both of these levers. And you can see that these two prefabs are working totally independently of one another. So that about wraps it up for this tutorial. Did seem a little bit overly complicated, and yet, we're making something that was ultimately a pretty simple puzzle. But really the point is more about explaining the workflows and the principles involved, because we can use these same ideas to make more and more complex puzzles. And keeping them as isolated logic blocks is a really good kind of practice. It makes organizing our game and our scenes just a lot easier to manage later on down the road when you're making more and more complex games.